Welcome to another Learning Council podcast. This is your host, LeiLani Coffin, CEO of Learning Council News Media and Research. So today our topic is going to be better human teaching connection. This is really a hot topic because people are freaked out by AI. And so we're going to bring up a technology area that I think is really, really cool with my friend, Tony Zeikle, who is the Senior Vice President of Revenue at Lightspeed Technologies. We've been friends for a long time.
We have. It's great to be with you again, Leilani.
Yeah. And you're speaking to me today from out on the West Coast.
I am. I am in Tualatin, Oregon, which is a suburb of Portland.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and
nice,
this
pretty
time of
area.
year, this time of year, Tualatin is very cloudy, dark, and damp. But I would
Oh,
encourage anybody who's going to visit Oregon to come in the summer. It's some of the best
yeah.
weather in the country.
We're starting to get cold here in Arkansas too, so it's kind of fun. All right, so we're going to talk about this better human teaching connection, but let's start with what are we going to frame this around? So tell me about Lightspeed and your technology because it's really kind of a hot area. It's a missing area people don't pay enough attention to, in my opinion. So give me the quick intro, but before you do that, tell me a little bit about your history. Like you got into this probably, how'd you do that?
Absolutely. I started my career in the safety and security business, actually, supporting K-12 schools as well as a lot of other government and military sites around their physical security. And obviously, that kind of bled into education. And then I moved to Lightspeed about 14 years ago and have been in various roles with Lightspeed. And we've really focused on Lightspeed on the auditory component in the classroom. The hearing is the primary channel by which students learn. And so, how can we improve the listening and learning environment, and how does that translate into teaching and learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being one of those students that always had to be in the front of the class because my last name started with a D, my maiden name. So the D's always end up in the front. But I remember a lot of people not being able to hear in the back of the room. Like I wouldn't wanted to be a Z named kid like you were. Did you experience that having a Z name? This would be perfect.
Absolutely. Yeah, to
Yeah.
start to, usually teachers would move you around throughout the year, but the very beginning of the school year, I was always in the back right corner. And I
Alphabetical.
always knew that I was going to be furthest away from the teacher because, especially at that point in time, it was a lot of sit and get, right? When we were
Yeah.
growing. So,
Yeah.
I knew I was going to have to overcome maybe more than those that were in the front of the classroom.
Yeah, yeah, like me. I think it encouraged my nearsightedness actually, but there you go. Okay, so let's explain what we're talking about when we're talking about, enhanced audio within the instructional audio within the classroom because it's a new world now, right?
Absolutely. And, Lightspeed has been in business for 30 years plus, really focused on this challenge that's happening in classrooms. Uh, Hearing is the primary channel by which students learn. We would never imagine in a classroom only putting a portion of the letters or a portion of the words on the screen and asking students to decipher it and to try to fit it all together. But if we're not delivering every single consonant and every single vowel to their ear clearly so that they can hear and understand it, in many ways, we're asking them to fill in the blanks. And there's so much research around this, the importance of this tied to learning for students, that if you're not
Yeah.
able to deliver every single consonant and vowel and every single word clearly to their ears, they're going to disengage, they're going to lose focus, and they're not going to understand the overall context of what the teacher is trying to explain and communicate. And I think that's even more prominent now with the rise of technology and what they're used to in terms of being native technologists growing up than it ever has been before.
Yeah, and that makes me realize there's a lot to this because I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of movies you can watch on TV now where the audio, whatever they did to mix the audio is just so bad. Like you can't hear anything the actors say, but the music is too loud in the background. And then I have my husband yelling from the other room or whatever, but what you can hear, I mean, a movie makes no sense if you can't hear what they're saying, right? So it's a little bit of crazy talk, but
Yeah, let me tell you a
makes a
story
lot of
about that.
sense
I
in
was
learning.
I was at a conference earlier this year in Florida, and one of the key chief technology officers from a major school district across the country was actually talking about AI, and it was a topic. And we were in a smallish ballroom, maybe like a large classroom size, actually not that different than a lot of the Learning Council events that you hold. And he was speaking, but the microphone in the room didn't work. So he just
Hmm.
continued to speak without using a microphone. And I was about two-thirds of the way back in the classroom. And I realized I was starting to disengage. I was conscious. And I realized,
Hmm.
you know what? Why am I disengaging? This topic is profoundly interesting. And everybody in the room, I think, it was a packed room, was very interested in the topic. But I realized I was really having to focus on just being able to hear him. And of course, with my background, I then pull out my phone and I pull out a decibel meter, and I realized that his volume to my ears was only at about 3 or 4 decibels above the ambient noise in the room. So
Ah,
the ambient noise in the room was right around 50 decibels of sound. And so his voice to my ears was only around 53 or 54 decibels. So I was consciously having to work harder to be able to hear him. And we know just from a signal to noise ratio standpoint that the ideal listening environment is for the signal, which is what you want to hear, to be at about
mhm.
15 decibels above the ambient noise. So ideally in that room, his voice to my ears would have been at about 65 decibels. And that would have allowed me to naturally hear that signal, what I needed to hear versus the noise around me. So I was thinking, is anybody else having the same challenge or is this just me? And so I looked
Yeah.
around, and of course, it was a room full of educators and education leaders. And I realized people were checking out too. They were starting to look at their phones, checking their emails, the things that we as adults do when we're like just not consciously focused on what's going on. And it just hit me at that point. I'm like, how often is this happening in our classrooms?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And then
And
you also have certain kids who are like loud and noisy anyway, and they're tapping their foot or they're scratching away on their desk or something. Yeah. And then you've got a teacher who's teaching 6 or 7 units a day. What does that do for their vocal cords? Like wow, right? So, okay, so let's
yes,
talk about the technologies then, because there's been huge innovations in this arena to actually solve this issue. And you guys have been doing that. I've seen them, right? But I want you to describe them for everyone so we understand.
absolutely. We simply put a lanyard microphone on a teacher, and it's not designed to be a PA system like you think in a large auditorium or in a public place that's providing just a huge amount of sound. But we're designing speakers that will deliver low volume but high intelligibility, evenly distributed throughout the classroom so that all students have an equitable listening experience. It allows that teacher to use their regular conversational voice. And what do we want from good teaching? We want them to be able to move around the room. We want them to be able to be conversational as they're speaking. Oftentimes, that means their back is going to be turned away from students as they're physically moving around the classroom. But for them to use their regular conversational voice is so invaluable. But delivering their voice clearly to every student's ear, no matter if they're in that back of the room, like we talked about, or the front, or wherever they are in proximity to the teacher, is what we're seeking to deliver. And we want it to be the teacher's natural voice. So, in many cases, people don't even realize that there's a speaker amplifying the teacher's voice or even students' voice. We want to do the same for students as they're sharing among their peers. We want to deliver that natural sound in the classroom. So, that's what we do. And to your point, teachers say about 15 to 20,000 words a day on average. The average person
Hmm.
says 5,000. A lot of times I'll be presenting in front of a lot of teachers and I'll say, what's the number one tool that you use? And they'll often, share their favorite app or curriculum or maybe their device. And I'll say, well, what about your voice? And they just have that look on their face like, well, of course, if I don't have my voice, I can't teach. I'm like, well, that's a tool, right?
Yeah,
And so what are you doing to add technology to the tool that you're using all day, every day to communicate to kids?
yeah, yeah. And then when you said also being able to have the voice of the student, I just picture, students being more engaged if they know they're going to be heard, like I am in the back of the room and they're shy kids. We all know that, and they don't speak up very loud. Maybe they were taught that at home, no yelling or whatever, or maybe they do yell a lot. But it's them being heard, putting them sort of on stage to use a mobile mic like that is awesome. So I'm picturing the lanyard. I want people that are just hearing us right now on the audio channels. So you got a lanyard, the little tiny box hanging around your neck with
Yeah.
magnetic
For those of you that
clasp.
are for those of you that
Yeah,
are on video, it's like this.
for the ones on video, you can see it. He's showing it. So that's pretty awesome. And then there's a mobile speaker that can be plugged in anywhere, right? Like that sits at the back of the room.
Yes,
And
we
it's
have our Red
awesome. It's
Cat
not a
system,
regular.
which is like this speaker right here. And this one
Yeah.
speaker will evenly distribute the sound up to a 1,500 square foot area. We also have installed speakers that can go into the ceiling and do the same thing. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, because some schools like to install things. Um, yeah, but this is a technology you could take with you almost anywhere. So if you've got a room in your school where you need it, you could just drag it over there. Yeah, and I've liked being able to see how it could engage small group as well. So you could hand out these little mic looking things, and then the little working groups can work together, and then they can share out from their table. That kind of
Yes.
added enhancement. I think for this the youth crowd of today, I just want to comment on this. The youth crowd of today loves to think about being little mini rock stars and everybody can hear them and holding something in their hand that they can share out. I think that's really cool. Um, but it also facilitates that small group engagement, which is what teachers are trying to do. In fact, we have our survey showing, that 64%, this is their number one priority teachers are talking about right now, is they know they need to get off lecturing all the time. They need to facilitate that discussion, right? Back and forth, not just them saying things, but the students saying things, Socratic discussion, or let's talk about this chapter, or whatever they're going to do. Or maybe they're using an interactive whiteboard, but they're also wanting to hear back from the whole class. So talk to me about what you see when people are using it.
Absolutely. And what you're alluding to is our Activate system, which is really small group pods that are going in with the individual small groups. And small group activity, actually, what becomes really important is not for students necessarily to need to hear the teacher at that point, but for the teacher to be able to hear the authentic interaction of the students as they're working. So if a teacher walks over to a small group as they're having dialogue, what happens? The
Yeah, they all
conversation.
shut up. They're like, oh, she's
Yes,
going to tell us
the
what to do now. Yeah.
conversation or the dynamic changes.
Yeah.
So what this does is it actually allows the teacher not only with the microphone, but also an earbud that comes up to their ear. They can actually
Mm.
select individual small groups and listen to that authentic interaction of those students as they're working together. It allows them to
Oh,
very,
from a distance, you mean?
yes,
Okay.
from a distance. So it actually allows them to be able to really understand several things all at once. First, are the students on task? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Are they having the dialogue that they've been instructed to have?
Yeah.
Additionally, is everybody participating in that group? Is it
Yeah.
just one person that's dominating the dialogue? Is it a safe discussion? Is it a collaborative discussion? And or is there one student that is just not engaged at all? And it also allows them to see how are they interacting with each other. I mean, that's career skills, right? It's like how are you communicating your evidence of learning with your peers? And oftentimes it can allow them to maybe hear that student's voice who won't speak up in front of the whole class, but maybe has some
Right.
really good ideas and can really highlight what they're doing really well and really articulate and provide that human connection that teachers crave. Teachers crave the human connection. I think so often teachers, the reason they got into teaching in the first place was because of the impact maybe a teacher made on them when they were growing up.
Yeah.
And they want to be able to pass that on to other students as well. And I think so much of what we have going on in our teaching profession today is actually taking teachers away from what they desire to do most and what they're most passionate about. And I think that's why we're developing teacher work shortages and the challenges that we're having in the profession. If we can get the profession back to where teachers can focus upon the difference that they can make and the impact that they can make in students' lives, and likewise, then have that human connection so that students can be impacted by them. I think that's just so powerful. And, so much of that is done through the auditory channel and just the communication of praise, the communication of instruction, the communication of encouragement that a teacher can provide, that students can provide to their peers, and that collaborative environment that can be built.
Yeah, and I really agree with you about that because now as I'm picturing in my mind, you've got 30 kids in front of you. Every time you speak, if you're trying to talk to all of them, you're on a certain sort of wavelength when you're all, right? It's totally different if it's twos or threes or fours and you're working them in a small group, like you're maybe listening in to some from a distance. The other thing that's happening right now in America, and there's been a lot of studies like this, 50% of the kids in any grade level are behind, sometimes 4, 5, 6, 7 grades behind, right? So here you are, you're trying to teach seventh grade math, and you got kids who are at second grade level in the same class. So now you have to break them into small groups because you're trying to accelerate a few of them, and the other ones are on the grade pattern. So how could you possibly say the same thing to all 30 the whole time, right? You've got to try to break it up, and you've got to try to listen in, and you've got, when you are speaking to the whole group, you have to be able to have real dialogue, because if some kids are behind, even just a year behind, they're going to try to tune out anyway because they're not getting it. They're just not where you're at. So I think it's really critical to be using this technology, and I can't believe that it's not almost mandatory everywhere, right? Like for me, it's just sort of ridiculous. Okay, so I'm going to move on and say that basically we both know everyone's looking for more human connection, and one of the reasons is during the pandemic we all had to be apart, and a lot of people realized, well, maybe I don't need school, and they started homeschooling or trying to find an alternative, or they were watching teachers just lecture via video conferencing, and they thought, well, this is kind of dumb. My kid's not engaged, and I don't want to do that. So I think there's really an imperative. I keep using that word. That's my favorite word today, Tony. I'm sorry, but um, there's an imperative for schools to actually be an activity of engagement, right? It has to be something where I'm excited to go there because I'm part of it. So talk to me about what you see this causing then, because it's audio and it's being able to hear and speak, but it can't be underrated.
Correct. And I think that that was one of the key things that people realized and discovered going through the pandemic was the need for human connection more than ever before. Because when they didn't have that, it significantly decreased student engagement in the
Oh
learning
yeah.
environment. So you have to almost have that as a foundation that students become engaged. Why do students become engaged? In many cases, it's because they have someone that cares about them, that is invested in them, in their interest, and providing that foundation and expectation that they will thrive and that they will do well and that they will succeed. So when you build that as the foundation and then you put them in a classroom setting and they realize, oh, I have a teacher that actually cares about me. I have other adults in my life that care about me and they want me to be successful. I think students naturally want to be successful in their education and as they grow. I think that's just natural and native to them. So let's create an environment whereby that engagement is happening. And thinking about just the rise of AI and just the direction that we're heading with AI, a lot of obviously this has been the year of AI, right? Just in terms of
Yeah.
discussion within education as well as just in our culture. And I think we're realizing that we need to make sure that AI becomes a tool to enhance human connection. And so if we can make AI a tool that teachers can utilize so that they can become better at that human connection and have AI take care of a lot of the other things that will actually make them better teachers, then I think we need to embrace that technology. And the same is true for students. If we can have AI be a tool that they're using in their learning environment that's going to make them more engaged in that learning process, then we need to embrace that because I think that's going to help them advance in terms of where they're headed in their lives.
Yeah, and I've always found in my own learning, I know this is true from research that I've seen, that your learning is captured as real knowledge when you have it acknowledged.
Hmm.
So because learning knowledge is sort of an ownership thing, right? Like you sort of like unlock the domain of some piece of data and now you've invaded it and now you own it as your own, but it doesn't really sink in like that as a real ownership unless it's acknowledged. Um, and we do that with testing, but when it's a human connection, like, oh, the teacher says to you, oh, you got it, right? Like, good job, right? That makes a world of difference. And I know from our own research during the pandemic, 50% of the kids sort of curled up in a ball, right? Like they didn't get anything done in 2 years. They're just way behind. The other 50% were like they were cool with it. They kind of, got stuff. But there's a lot of humanity that really absolutely has to have that human connection that you're talking about. Or they're just not going to progress. They're not into it because the group isn't into it or no one's acknowledging them.
Well,
So
and to maybe add a couple of things to that, think about when you were in school and you got a good grade on a paper. What was more impactful? A teacher giving you a letter grade on a paper, or the teacher actually coming up to you and saying, this, and this were really impactful in your paper. And it really showed me how much you studied and how much you researched this topic. And you really came out with some really compelling conclusions. That
yeah,
kind of affirmation is going to, I mean, we know it's going to drive a student so much further than just looking on a screen and seeing a letter grade on something. It
yeah,
could be A, B, C, whatever, but it's not, what is that doing for that student compared to that verbal affirmation from a teacher that's invested in them?
yeah, yeah. Or even if you're working in a small group together with other kids and the other student says, "Oh, that's a good idea," to you.
Absolutely. Even
I
more
mean, there's
so
just
in
so
some
much to
cases,
this
right?
communication. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Even more so sometimes, right? Especially in a school environment when they're being affirmed by their peers. How powerful is that? And if we can actually invest in our students in such a way that they can be confident enough that they can share positive things with their peers about what they're seeing, that's building great relationships.
Yeah, and we started out this talking about the better human teaching connection. Um, but you've got these traditional schools competing with online schools, right? Where there's very little human teaching, and a lot of those are doing really well. Um, but our research is now showing, the Learning Council research is showing that's not necessarily what the consuming public wants. They do want this human connection. Um, and so schools are out there, desperately trying to create that. Do you feel that there's still a lot of them overlooking this whole issue? Like they're not getting that audio is so critical?
Absolutely. And I would just add, I know that a lot of those online are doing well in terms of enrollment numbers, but I don't know that it necessarily means that those students are thriving because I think a lot of times that human connection is lost. So I think we need to dive into those data points a little bit deeper to really understand if they're thriving. But
Yeah, the data does show that there's a huge drop off
mhm,
if there's no teacher check-in at all. I'm talking about the chat bot online, right? Like they're going to chat bot with you and use AI to teach you, and there's no human connection at all. Now there are online schools with a check-in, right?
yeah.
An occasional moment of class togetherness. But it's just definitely not the same.
Mhm.
And the majority of places that are not willing to move that direct, parents are not willing to move that direction is really people that are like, no, my kid needs a person, right? I mean, that's just our reality. And I agree with that. I think that you actually have to have human teaching, but the degree to which it's experiential to appeal to the current alpha generation has to go way up, right? It can't like we can't teach the whole class like they're all at the same place and they're all the same person like we could for what 100 years that we were doing this. We just can't. We have a good percentage of kids that are brand new to the country in a lot of classes. We have the need to address people with learning difficulties. We've got a lot of that going on in classrooms now. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of them that are way behind. The pandemic really wiped out a lot of education for the homogeneity of the groups. So we definitely need to talk about that. Um, all right, so let's get into the experiential aspects then, because I think one of the drivers that I'm looking at for schools is how do they attract and retain? And I keep telling them that you attract and retain students by being in a hub of experience. If you tell them you're going to just come here all day and sit there and listen, and it's not really highly interactive like they can do right on their own mobile phones and play games or or fun, then they're not going to do it. So I think there's a huge part of the experiential component that has to be put in, and this is one of them. So what do you have to say about that?
I think the students of today expect a brilliant auditory experience. They are being raised in a world where they're used to having headphones in and being able to adjust their volume and being
Mm-hmm.
able to have it exactly right for what their ears need to hear. So you transform that into the classroom, and if they don't
Mm-hmm.
have a tremendous auditory experience in the classroom like they're used to everywhere else with the
Mm-hmm.
technology that they use, then it's going to result in engagement, or disengagement. So I think now more than ever before, making sure that that auditory experience is really important. And I think more and more school districts are realizing that. We've seen a huge increase in the percentage of classrooms that have audio. Instructional audio as part of their standard package of technology that's in the classroom. And oftentimes, when that's the case, the teachers will immediately say, this is the number one tool that I need, because it really gets back to using their voice all day, every day, and being able to deliver that in the classroom. So I think it's becoming more and more common, but we need to continue to talk about that importance and the
Yeah,
research that's behind it.
yeah, yeah. And you just mentioned something that I think is really important to talk about, and that is ears. These students of today, they are with headsets on for a huge portion of time. And I know I've read that there's a certain amount of hearing loss in the youth because they crank it up way too loud. And I even worry about my own hearing because I fly everywhere and I
Mhm.
always have a headset on when I fly in order to reduce the noise of the airplane because it helps me relax more. I mean, that ambient noise of the loud engines for, 4 or 5 hours on in flight, it is really sort of makes you a nervous wreck by the time it makes you tired, right? But then I have to, if I'm listening to something, I have to turn it up higher and I'm worried I'm ruining my hearing. Do you find that schools are attracted to this technology because they know they've got kids in classrooms with potential hearing problems?
For sure. And we know that hearing problems are on the rise. Educational audiologists, the number of referrals that they're getting now compared to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago is on the increase. And some of it may tie to the technology and the amount of sound that kids are putting to their ears, but there's also components tied to allergies and different things that cause some hearing loss, as well as just, colds and sickness that happens that provides temporary hearing challenges for students as well. And then, obviously you have students that are easily prone to distraction, and just being able to deliver better sound to their ears is going to help them focus more as well. So there's pretty substantiated research around all of those components. And another one that you mentioned, previously was just around students that are not native English speakers. And I
Mm,
think the data around that now is it's actually over 10% of our US student population is in that
yeah,
boat right now. So, and it continues to increase year after year. So, really trying to meet those students where they're at, and especially as they're learning the English language, being able to deliver those consonants and vowels clearly to their ears shows a pretty significant increase in word recognition as they're listening in that mainstream classroom, as well as just helping them to capture and stay engaged. You think about, whenever you're learning a new language, or I even had it one time where a presenter had a really strong English accent, and I was struggling to hear all of the words that was being said. And I realized after a while, I was only hearing maybe a third of the words that they were sharing, even though it was in English. They had a really strong Australian accent. And
Yeah.
I realized I was disengaging because I just couldn't capture all the words. And, that's even more so for students. There's research that says that students need to hear over 90% of the words spoken in the classroom in order to understand the context. If LeiLani, if you were only hearing about 50% of the words that I was sharing right now, you would be able to piece together the words you're not hearing from the words that you are. But
Probably. We hope so.
we hope so. But young listeners just don't fill in the blanks in the same way because of their, background and education.
Yeah, and especially if they're a foreign language student, which, like you said, is at least 10%. The parts of the country, it's much higher. It's much, much higher.
It is.
All right. So we talked about experiential aspects and the idea that, you really have to have this as a baseline technology. It used to be that the chalkboard was like the main thing that people use. This is making me ancient, but I remember chalkboards. And then it was like the interactive whiteboard was the thing, right? Projectors were in there and that for a really long time. Until finally, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, it became like if you don't have that, if you don't have projection and a screen and maybe an interactive whiteboard, then you're just, what are you even doing here? This isn't even a classroom. But this technology, it feels like it should have been going in at the same time, right? It's almost like on a leg, right? It should have already happened. um, Especially with the state of the student population being able to hear this. And now I think even one more complicating problem is that there is a huge teacher shortage, Tony. It's massive. I can't even believe the size of it. And every superintendent that I talk to says that's one of their number one things is just recruiting and retaining student or retaining teachers. Like, how do they get them to stay? And they lose a good portion of the first 5 year ones. So, right, they're a new teacher, and then after 4 years, they burn out entirely. The ones that have been in the seat for 20 years, they're not likely to go until they retire. But just even getting the ones that are close to retirement to not retire right on time to stay a little while longer, really hard to do. I don't know how they're surviving now that they also have to carry more units, right?
Mhm.
So it used to maybe be, 4 or 5 units. Now it's 7 and 8. Like, you're teaching all day. I don't know how you do that. I really don't know how teachers do that. So I would think that they would be dying for a technology that's going to make it so they don't have to shout. Like, when they always say at every conference you go to, I'm going to use my teacher voice now, and they just shout. I'd lose my vocal cords. I would end up not being able to teach.
Well, and the other thing that we're realizing too is, and we've had this request, so we're adding and really incorporating this into our technology, is just around how can we improve overall communication across a school campus? Gone are the days where a teacher walks into their classroom and they're only with their students all day, every day. They need additional support from staff all across the campus. In some cases, they might need a nurse because of a medical issue. They might need a janitor because a mess was made. They might need a behavioral specialist because of a challenge a specific student is having in the classroom. And so what we realized is we have this teacher wearable around their neck. How can we leverage that for additional purposes? So, we have the ability to be able to integrate with the paging and intercom system for discrete alert. And we also have the ability to integrate with phone systems so that they can actually place a call directly from their microphone to the office and have that quick two-way communication to be able to have additional behavioral support, or even just to communicate, hey, a student is going down to the office right now because they need a different environment, something like that.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah. So right here from the thing hanging around your neck, you have a security and intercom system back to the main office. The security thing is huge, though. Let's not underrate this, Tony, because the other thing that every superintendent and every principal you talk to is worried about is safety and security. If there's ever been a better reason to pull your kid out of school, it's worrying about that, right? So they have to create safe and secure environments. So what you're telling me is that this thing that's magnetically on a lanyard hanging around your neck is instantaneous security alert. You
Yeah,
don't have to run
there's a
somewhere.
button right here on the side. You press and hold it for 3 seconds, and immediately there's going to be a red alert that hits the office, knowing that room 221 has an emergency.
As an intruder or something. Wow. Okay, well, that's a real driver. Yeah. Well, this has been a super fun thing. Are you having fun with this technology? I mean, this is super cool.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've been with Lightspeed for 14 years, and honestly, I love what we do. I love the impact that we make. I love working for a company like ours that is able to share a lot of the things that I've shared with you in this podcast. And in many cases, a lot of these things are things that people don't naturally think about. So being able to communicate to them and talk about how this matters to students
Mhm.
and the other thing that's most fulfilling is when we put our systems into the classrooms and we get the responses from teachers that say, this saved my career. I've been shouting so long to try to reach the students in the back of the room. Now I don't have to anymore. Now I can deliver my natural voice, and I've realized that the overall volume in the classroom has gone down. You talked about how much noise there is on an airplane. Same is true in a
Yeah.
classroom, right?
Yeah.
But they actually realized I used to think that my students weren't listening to me. Now I realize they weren't hearing me. You think about the difference in those dynamics and the ability for the teacher to use so much more intonation in their voice because they can talk in that regular conversational voice and have the student that is 3 feet away from them in the front row or the student that's in the back row have that same connection to the teacher. Uh,
Oh,
that's
yeah. Oh, but
that's
Tony, that makes
really
me want to cry because if I heard a teacher say that to me, I would want to cry. If a teacher said, I thought they just, were tuning out and they didn't want to pay attention to me, but really they just couldn't hear me, I would want to cry. That's very emotional. I'm sorry. But that's very emotional. Imagine a teacher having that turn around for them. Like how gratifying, right? How amazingly gratifying. So that's really great. Well, this has been super fun. Did we miss anything really important? Because I go off on tangents.
well, you're just going to have to invite me back sometime so that we can continue the
Yeah, I
conversation.
want to hear like more stories like that. Those are so much fun. Yeah, I'll have to invite you back because people need to know that this is a critical part, and I think they need to see it, more. Like exactly. Well, great. Well, Tony, this has been super fun. Thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you for listening, all my listeners, to another episode of the Learning Council's podcast. This has been your host, LeiLani Cawthon. Keep listening and keep learning.